If I hadn't gone to the bathroom that night, I wouldn't be alive today. And that's not something I say lightly, because I replayed that moment in my head more times than I can count, especially during the sleepless nights when my mind refuses to let it go. At the time, I was working the graveyard shift at a gas station just off Interstate 40 in northern Arizona, a stretch of highway known for being long, empty, and unforgiving, with miles of desert in every direction and absolutely nothing around except darkness once the sun goes down. The nearest town was almost 20 miles away, and during night shift like this one, it felt less like a job and more like being stranded in the middle of nowhere, trapped inside a glass box lit by flickering fluorescent lights. It was around 2:47 a.m., and the silence was so complete that even the hum of the refrigerators sounded too loud, like it didn't belong. No cars had passed in nearly half an hour. The sky was moonless, and the air outside looked thick and black through the windows, almost solid, like something you'd step into and disappear. I remember feeling uneasy for no clear reason, that subtle pressure in your chest that tells you something is off before your brain catches up, and I kept glancing at the reflection in the glass doors because I had this irrational fear that someone would suddenly be standing behind me. That's when the doorbell rang. The sharp metallic sound cut through the silence so violently that I actually jumped, my heart slamming against my ribs as I turned toward the entrance. And that's when I saw him. He was tall, taller than average and unnaturally thin, the kind of thin that doesn't look healthy, like his body was stretched over a frame that didn't quite fit. He moved slowly as he stepped inside, not limping, not injured, just deliberately slow, as if he was making sure I noticed every step he took. The first thing that locked my attention, though, was his face, specifically his eyes. They were wide open, far too wide, and completely unblinking, staring straight ahead with a fixed intensity that made my skin crawl, like he was concentrating very hard on pretending to be normal. His clothes looked worn and dirty, maybe even homeless, but what stood out were the dark stains smeared across his jacket and sleeves, stains that were still glossy under the lights, not dried, not old, and my brain immediately tried to rationalize it. Oil, grease, maybe rust, but deep down I knew it didn't make sense. He didn't acknowledge me at first, didn't approach the counter or look at the shelves like a normal customer would. Instead, he stopped just inside the doorway and slowly turned his head to the right, his gaze settling on the narrow hallway that led to the bathroom in the back of the station, and he just stood there, staring at it, motionless. I cleared my throat and asked if I could help him, forcing my voice to sound calm even though my hands were already starting to sweat, but he didn't respond. For several seconds, the only sound in the entire building was the buzz of the lights above us, and the silence stretched on long enough that it became uncomfortable, almost painful. Then, finally, he spoke, and the sound of his voice made my stomach twist. It was low, quiet, and rough, like his throat had been damaged or he wasn't used to speaking out loud. And he said nothing more than, "bathroom." Just that one word. I told him that the bathroom was closed during night hours, which was store policy for safety reasons, especially since I was working alone. And as soon as I said it, I saw something change in his expression. His lips slowly pulled into a smile, but it wasn't friendly or apologetic. It was tight and forced, like his face didn't remember how to smile properly, and his eyes never stopped staring. He took a small step closer to the counter and said he only needed to wash his hands, and that he'd be quick, promising in a tone that felt rehearsed, like he'd said it before. And as he lifted his hands slightly, I noticed they were trembling not from fear, but from what looked like barely contained excitement. That was the moment my instincts fully kicked in, every alarm in my body screaming that something was wrong, and I shook my head and repeated that I couldn't let him use the bathroom, trying to keep my distance as I reached for the sliding security window. Before I could close it, he leaned in closer, lowering his voice even more, and asked me a question that made the blood drain from my face, asking if I knew why the girl at the previous gas station had died. And the way he said it, calm, casual, almost curious, told me he wasn't asking out of concern. My hands moved on their own as I slammed the window shut and locked it, the loud click echoing through the store, and for a split second, I thought he might rush the counter or start banging on the glass, but he didn't. He just stood there, smiling, staring at me through the window with those unblinking eyes, and I realized I was holding my breath without meaning to. Neither of us moved for what felt like an eternity, and then slowly, he turned around and walked back outside, stopping just beyond the doors where the light didn't quite reach. And that's where he stayed, standing perfectly still in the darkness, watching me, as the clock above the register ticked forward minute by agonizing minute. And all I could think was that whatever this man wanted, the bathroom was only part of it. And I had a terrifying feeling that he wasn't done yet. I stayed frozen behind the counter long after he stepped back into the darkness outside, my eyes locked on the glass doors, as if looking away for even a second would somehow invite him back inside. And the worst part was how silent everything became once the bell stopped echoing, because now I could hear my own breathing, shallow and uneven, and the pounding of my heart felt loud enough to give me away. The man didn't leave the property. I knew that immediately, even though I couldn't clearly see him anymore, because every instinct in my body told me he was still there, just beyond the reach of the fluorescent lights, standing in that thick black space where the desert swallowed everything whole. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, that night shifts mess with your head and make ordinary people seem threatening. But the image of those wet, dark stains on his clothes kept forcing its way back into my thoughts, and no matter how hard I tried to rationalize them, my mind kept landing on the same conclusion. Minutes passed painfully slowly, each second stretching out like it didn't want to end, and I forced myself to look down at the register just to break eye contact with the doors, but the reflection in glass betrayed me, showing a faint outline of a tall figure standing outside, completely motionless. He wasn't pacing, wasn't smoking, wasn't on his phone like normal customers who get locked out at night. He was just standing there, facing the building, staring straight at me, and the realization sent a chill through my entire body. I checked the time again and saw that only 3 minutes had passed, even though it felt closer to 30, and my hands were shaking so badly that I had to grip the edge of the counter to steady myself. I considered calling the police, my finger hovering over my phone, but the thought of explaining what had happened made me hesitate, because technically he hadn't done anything illegal yet, and I was afraid they'd brush it off as nothing, leaving me alone again with the knowledge that he was still out there. Another few minutes crawled by, and I started to wonder if this was some kind of sick intimidation tactic, if he was waiting for me to relax or make a mistake, when suddenly he moved. Not quickly, not aggressively, just one slow step closer to the door, emerging slightly into the light so that I could see his face again, and his smile was gone now, replaced by a blank, empty expression that somehow felt even worse. He raised one hand and lightly knocked on the glass, not loud enough to be threatening, but deliberate, controlled, as if he wanted to remind me he was still there, and then he did something that made my stomach drop. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead gently against the glass, his eyes inches from mine, wide and unblinking, fogging the surface with his breath. I could see every detail of his face up close. The cracked lips, the faint scars along his jaw, the way his pupils seemed too dark, almost swallowing the whites of his eyes, and I felt a wave of panic crash over me so intense that I nearly shouted for him to leave. Instead, he whispered something I couldn't hear through the glass, his lips moving slowly, carefully, and even though no sound reached me, I somehow understood that whatever he was saying wasn't meant to be comforting. He stayed like that for what felt like forever, just staring, breathing against the glass, until finally he pulled back and turned away, walking off toward the side of the building where the bathroom entrance was located, disappearing from view entirely. For a brief moment, relief washed over me, and I thought maybe he'd given up and was leaving. But then I remembered the layout of the station, how the bathroom was connected to the building by a narrow exterior hallway that wasn't visible from the counter, and the realization hit me that if he found a way inside from there, I wouldn't see him until it was too late. My mind raced through worst-case scenarios as I grabbed the phone, and finally dialed 911. My voice barely steady as I explained that there was a suspicious man on the property who refused to leave, and while the dispatcher asked me questions, I kept glancing toward the back hallway, half expecting to see him suddenly appear at the end of it. The dispatcher told me officers were on the way, but that it could take some time due to my remote location, and hearing that made my chest tighten, because time was the one thing I felt I didn't have. I hung up and locked myself behind the counter, every muscle in my body tense, listening intently for any sound that didn't belong, the creak of a door, the scrape of footsteps, even the faintest shift in the air, but the building remained unnaturally quiet. That silence stretched on until it became unbearable, and that's when I heard it, a soft, deliberate sound coming from the back of the store, like the slow dragging of shoes across tile, and my blood ran cold as I realized that the man I thought was still outside might already be inside, moving to the shadows where the cameras didn't quite reach. And in that moment, standing alone in the middle of the desert with nowhere to run and no one to help, I understood with terrifying clarity that whatever game he was playing with me was far from over, and that the bathroom door separating us was the only thing keeping me alive. I don't remember deciding to go to the bathroom so much as I remember suddenly being there, standing in front of the narrow hallway with my heart hammering so hard it felt like it was shaking my entire body, because the silence inside the store had become unbearable, and my mind had convinced itself that if I stayed frozen behind the counter any longer, whatever was hiding in the back would come to me instead. I told myself I just needed a moment to breathe, to splash water on my face, to reset my nerves, and that thought alone still makes me sick when I think about how close I came to dying because of it. As I walked down the hallway, every step echoed too loudly, and the flickering light above me cast long, distorted shadows that stretched across the walls, making it feel like I was moving through something alive rather than a building I'd worked in for months. The bathroom door creaked when I pushed it open, and the smell of damp concrete and industrial cleaner hit me immediately, grounding me just enough to stop my hands from shaking as violently as they had been. I locked the door behind me, leaned against the sink, and stared at my reflection, barely recognizing the pale, wide-eyed person looking back at me, my face slick with sweat, my jaw clenched so tightly it ached. I remember telling myself out loud that I was fine, that the man was gone, that help was on the way, but the words sounded hollow even as I said them, because deep down I knew something was wrong in a way that couldn't be explained by fear alone. I stayed in that bathroom longer than I should have, trying to calm my breathing, and when I finally stepped back into the hallway, the air felt different, heavier somehow, like it had been disturbed while I was gone. That's when I noticed a sound, or rather, the lack of it, because the constant hum of the refrigerators and lights that had been there all night was gone, replaced by an unnatural quiet that made my ears ring. I walked back toward the counter slowly, my eyes scanning every corner of the store, and that's when I saw the police lights flashing to front windows, red and blue washing over shelves in rhythmic pulses that made my knees nearly give out with relief. 2 officers were standing outside, guns holstered but hands ready, and when they saw me, one of them raised a hand and motioned for me to stay where I was. They entered cautiously, sweeping the store before approaching me, and one of them asked if I was okay and whether the man had come inside at any point, and I told him no, that the man had stayed outside the whole time, watching, waiting, never crossing the threshold. The officer didn't respond right away, and the look he exchanged with his partner made my stomach sink, because it wasn't confusion or disbelief. It was concern. He asked me to come with him to the patrol car, and once I was outside, wrapped in the cold desert air, he pulled up the security footage on a small screen and told me to watch closely. The video showed exactly what I remembered. The man entering the store, standing near the door, staring toward the bathroom, but then the angle shifted to another camera, one I rarely paid attention to, and my blood ran cold as I saw something I knew couldn't be right. While I was still behind the counter, after I had slammed the security window shut, the man didn't leave the store like I thought. He stepped calmly around into the counter and walked into the employee-only area, moving with purpose, his eyes fixed on the hallway I would later walk down. I watched myself on the screen, unaware, fiddling with the register, while just a few feet behind me, the man stood completely still, close enough to reach out and touch me, and in his right hand was a long knife that caught the light as he adjusted his grip. The officer paused the footage and told me that when I went to the bathroom, the man followed me partway down the hallway before stepping back into a blind spot where the cameras didn't reach, waiting, listening, deciding, and that the only reason he didn't attack me was because police units had already been dispatched and were approaching the area faster than expected. My legs felt weak as they told me what they found behind the building, near the exterior bathroom entrance. 3 bodies, all adults, all killed within hours of each other, their hands washed clean in the same sink I had just used, and the realization of how close I came to becoming the 4th made me physically ill. The officers explained that the man had been moving from gas station to gas station along the highway, targeting places with night shifts and isolated locations, and that I had unknowingly interrupted whatever ritual he was carrying out that night. As they spoke, I couldn't stop staring back at the building, at the bathroom door glowing faintly under the fluorescent lights, knowing that just minutes earlier, a man with a knife had been standing in the dark behind me, deciding whether or not I was going to live. Even now, years later, I can't hear the sound of a gas station bell or see an empty highway at night without feeling that same pressure in my chest, that same certainty that someone is watching just out of sight, And sometimes, when sleep refuses to come, I still see his face in my mind, not angry, not rushed, just patient, like he knew I'd remember him for the rest of my life. And that, somehow, was the point.